Chapter 17. The next morning found Anne waking to a good deal of light pouring through the window, and a bath waiting for her in the bedroom before the fireplace. She rose slowly, uncertain of her body yet. She seemed all right, even clear-headed. She picked up her watch as she slipped out of her dressing gown, which she had apparently fallen asleep in. It was just after noon, but understandable considering how late she had taken her new medicine. She undressed, pinned up her hair, and slid into the bath, careful not to submerge her face. As she washed, she tried to remember anything of the night, and found that everything after the shot glass of sickly sweet yet bitter brew was a blissful blank. Without asking, the house told her she slept like the dead, unlike previous nights. Thankfully, it didn't elaborate on previous nights. It would explain the increasing doses of the poteen. She understood why all the bottles had been in the bin when Skye had asked. It was the brownie's way of getting her help. Anne's half-thought question of why the tub was in the bedroom was answered by an image of the stubborn Scotsman from next door sleeping on a pallet in the front room, then by a more current image of him and Elizabeth sitting at the table eating a lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches, which, the house proudly informed her, the child had made herself. With this information, she rushed through her bath and dressed. There was a sandwich waiting for her, and Anne kissed the top of Elizabeth's head, whispering, "Thank you, my wee brownie," to her. Elizabeth looked shocked for all of a second, then put on her indignant face. "How rude!" Anne laughed softly, and Elizabeth giggled. "How did you know I made them?" Anne ignored the question smoothly and picked up the teapot. She glanced inside and saw there was enough for maybe a cup and a half. She poured less than a full cup for herself, getting up to set the remainder in the press while it was still warm, and closed the press door. Elizabeth frowned. "You aren't going to wash that first?" Anne added a lump of sugar to her own tea and slowly stirred as she answered, "1, the brownie will wash it when she's done. 2, normally I'd put it on the counter and leave it for her, but I thought she might like it while it's still hot. This way she can." Skye rose to put his dishes in the sink. "So you're sure it's female?" Anne gave him her shrugging nod. "Fairly certain. She takes no offence to my calling her so, and there have been clues." That was all she would say on the matter as she ate her sandwich. Elizabeth watched Skye come back to the table, and the way he watched Anne as she ate gave her the feeling she shouldn't be here. "May I be excused? I'm done, and I'd like to go down and play in the garden." Anne nodded. "You may, if you open the pantry and take the little bowls of milk and honey down to the back wall, by the lily of the valley. Tuck it into the flowers for me." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled at the thought of feeding fairies and jumped at the chance. She put her dishes with Skye's and opened the pantry. "There's a little white roll here, too," she announced. Anne tipped her head. "Take it too, then." "Ah, apparently Martha makes fairy rolls on All Saints' Day. That is also for the pixies," she added as she was informed of the tradition by the table. Once the child was out the back door, Skye spoke up. "How'd it work?" he asked. "Fair fine, I think," she smiled. "I feel actually rested." "Thank you." Skye seemed only a little relieved. "Good. But there's somewhat else the witch said. You cannot take it too long. No dreams apparently makes you mad, and they won't fade on their own." "I'll be fine, thank you." He growled, but didn't push the matter further. There was something about her this morning that made him think it would have the opposite effect. He got up from the table. "Well, I doubt she'll give me another. She said you'd find yourself a dreamer." "I've got to go. Got a few things to do before I get the SUV again to take you and the wee lass home." She nodded. "Again, thank you. For everything." He growled again. "I think I'd be more comfortable on you treated me according to your brownie, lass, regarding the thanks." "Thanks." "Very well," she breathed. "We'll be ready to leave at 4 if that gives you enough time." "Aye." Skye took his leave, and Anne finished her brunch and headed out into the garden to check on the yellow rose, which was still doing poorly. Life seemed to speed by. Between the nightly potion and the cottage, Anne finally began to feel rested and more herself again, able to function. She found she still had to watch out for certain stimuli, or she would get caught up and spiral into the vision trap, but her sleep was no longer dangerous. Elizabeth's lessons with Sean were going well, and Anne's skill with her stick were improving. Ian had been true to his word about Juan. The small Filipino man had a great deal of disdain for weapons, but once he had met Anne, he was more than happy to teach her an entire style of fighting for her shillelagh. He said it was from his country, though he taught her some fencing moves to go with it. When she sparred with Skye after those lessons, he found her growing more and more dangerous. He noticed nothing in her behavior that caused him to worry about her, and eventually put matters from his mind and concentrated on her skills. Anne continued to go to courts on Friday and Wednesday nights for her dinner, and even to the Hedgegate at least twice a month, usually with Skye and the others after Sunday dinner at the manor. Johnny was not always there, but often enough that she was no longer surprised when he either appeared at her table or seemed to have been there the whole time. One night, when he gave her another batch of sheet music, she explained that all she could read was the lyrics, that reading music was not a skill she had ever learned. She handed him the small music device. "This thing lets me hear the music. I just tell it what I need to hear." "How do you operate it?" he asked with a soft laugh, turning the smartphone over in his hands. There were no buttons, just a touchscreen. Anne tipped her head. "I ask it. Things talk to me, remember?" His eyebrow arched at that. "Bit risky, isn't it?" After that last. She smiled. I was hasty with that thing. And it was eager to be understood, known. Things just want to talk to me, it seems. I suspect it was the little prince's doing. He was always more of a child than the other two. Lingered in that stage where everything was real and could talk. By the way, it said that if you send it the songs you want me to hear, it'll play them whenever I ask. Johnny handed it back to her. "I don't know how to operate those infernal things any more than you do. And I can see it." "Ask Bethany?" He nodded. "There might be a plan in that. Make sure she has the phone number." "Phone number? No, that's a different device." He laughed softly. "No, Keobranach. That there is a phone. One of those smartphones. I personally object to an object that's smarter than its user. I'll just send you lyric sheets then. Easier to get and modify. And have Bethany send you the music." "Thank you for going through the effort," she said, putting away the secondary phone, which was happily telling her that it was a very smart phone. "I'm woefully behind on modern music, and I've missed a fair bit, it seems, of traditional." He sipped his beer with a gesture of it being no matter. "You have an interest, and it pleases me to hear you sing. You've a good voice that shouldn't be wasted." She blushed. "'Tis barely suitable for lullabies and laments. I've no training." "Thank God for that," he said, perhaps a bit more curtly than he had intended. "Your voice has power for all the rough edges. Its beauty is in its raw state. I know too many technically perfect singers who can't emote their way out of a broken jar. Your voice has a soul. Don't put it down." He said little more that night, having spotted Seraphina in the crowd on the dance floor, and his mood soured quickly after that. Nor was that the only night Seraphina made her presence known. There were times Anne would catch glimpses of her watching. Occasionally, Seraphina would get up on stage and sing something whose lyrics Anne could tell were aimed at her, or Johnny if he was obviously present. And Anne got the feeling Johnny's earlier remark about technically perfect but soulless had been about her. The woman seemed to be feeling Anne out, trying to get a reaction. Anne ignored her as best she could, which was impressive, until the woman started getting others to go up and sing things for her. Things with very rhythmic, sharp beats that slowly began to sound like hammers ringing on metal. Anne would have to leave shortly into that. By the end of November, the bottle was nearly empty, and she began to short her doses, making it last. She was getting less sleep as a result. The night after she took the last dose, sleep refused to come at all, and not even the poteen could coax it out of hiding. She started sitting up and reading, then writing, but nothing helped. For a few days, alcohol in excessive amounts would make her fall asleep, but she always woke up screaming within an hour or two and would be unable to sleep again. Early December saw her 4 days awake and visibly worn to the point that Sharon insisted she take some time off to rest. Anne got the impression she was worried Anne was either coming down with something serious or on something, as Elizabeth put it. The child was the one who told Anne what her mother was thinking. She had convinced her mother that it was exhaustion, and that was why Sharon wanted her to take some time off. "Besides," Elizabeth added as she sat on the bed, watching Anne sitting in the rocking chair with her crochet, "we're going up to Virginia to Grandma's for Christmas. You should at least go home to your family, too." The child lowered her brows and glared at her governess in a fair imitation of her own stern looks. "You should have that looked at anyway. See Baba Yanni. Something." Anne sighed, knowing the girl was right. Perhaps she could go see the young prince. He was a dreamer, she remembered, though she was loath to let him know that one of his gifts had turned against her. "I'll see what I can do. Just you remember to do what Sean taught you about protecting yourself, keeping things from noticing you." She handed her the original cell phone, the one with the buttons. "Here, keep this with you while you're there. Roulette's number is the 4th button on the bottom row and then 1. If something happens, call her and drop the phone. She'll be with you shortly." You mean the first number on the speed dial? If you say so. Wednesday night, though she had intended to stay home and sleep, she went to courts, out of boredom and the need to do something. The silence in the cottage was making her see things, small animals or insects out of the corner of her eyes. She knew it was the lack of sleep, as the brownie would never have allowed such things, but there was little she could do about it. And with Elizabeth gone, she was not risking the sleeping pills again. She was working on day 5 of straight wakefulness, and nothing was working. She figured if she kept going, eventually she would just pass out. When she came in, it was a little quieter than normal. She noticed the new bartender immediately. He was touched. He was a gorgeous man, perfect, creamy skin, thick, dark curls, and the bluest eyes she had ever seen on a cat. There's no denying there was something of the feline about him. It took on longer than it should have to realize he was the man who had been given the special apple by the witch on Samhain. He was different now, no longer a man who was made to resemble a beast, but a beast who occasionally looked like a man. She began, not sure how to approach the subject politely. I remember you from the rest. Samhain, wasn't it? He smiled. Yeah, he beamed. Best night of my life. Really? She asked. She introduced herself. He reached over the bar to shake her hand. Silhouette. That's all I got right now. Memory and all, he said with a chuckle, as if she would understand. Which she did. When'd you get out? Anne was aware the moment the words left her lips that it sounded like he had just gotten out of prison. In a way, it was likely true, but still rude. Before she could apologize, he laughed. Oh, about 3 weeks before Halloween. If I see you out that way one night, I'll tell you about it. Hell of a story. She nodded. You'll have to forgive me. I live at the rest, but work out here. She indicated the world beyond the bar. I don't get in much. He shrugged. It happens. Not like we do a mass get-together more than 8 times a year, he laughed. I'll likely see you around. I like it here. Roulette was nice enough to give me a job. Get me settled. Brad's on vacation, so they needed help. That and business is picking up. They wanted extra help ready before New Year's. If business is picking up, why's the place dead then? She asked with a ghost of a smile. Holidays. It'll start jumping closer to Christmas and after. Can I get you something beautiful? She blushed. Ugh, flattery, sir. He shook his head, resting his powerful, bare arms on the bar. Flattery is when you don't mean it and you want something. I find your eyes fascinating. And, he added, standing straighter, as if pulling himself away from her eyes with effort, I don't want something. Well, I do. I want you to tell me what you want to drink. Tea. To my table, Jon. Kaylee knows. I don't usually come to the bar. I wanted to ask you, but it would be rude. He grinned, very cat-like. So let's be barbarians and dare. She blushed again, but allowed his charm to put her at ease. I was concerned because I see a change in you, since the apple and all, and I wondered what she did to you. I got something from her myself and was worried. There might be side effects? He nodded. Entirely possible, and wise of you, Miss Anne. But I couldn't be happier with what that apple did to me. Find me at Yule and I'll show you. When she flushed crimson and started to take a step back, he moved back, putting up his hands. Nothing improper, I assure you. There was no lie in him, and she relaxed, her blush fading a little. So, you sure I can't get you something a bit stronger than tea? I'm usually pretty good at figuring out what folks will like. It's a gift, he enticed. She hesitated. Finally, she gave in. It could not hurt at this point. Aye. I'll tell you, though, I'm not fond of bears or Jamesons. He looked her over critically. How do you take your tea? Preferred? Honey, just a touch. The tea itself? Strong side. Though occasionally I like a delicate brew for flavour. He began to putter around behind the bar, thought about mixing several things, but his hands stopped before he grabbed anything. Finally, he latched onto a bottle of American honey and seemed satisfied, poured her a measure in a chilled glass. He slid it in front of her with quiet purpose. She watched him, assessing his manner. He was confident, even though she wasn't, and picked up the drink. The cold glass felt good in her hand. The liquid smelled slightly sweet and enticing. She remembered the honeyed poteen the brownie had been making her and took a sip. The amber liquid felt thick and silky. It was sweet and heavy, with just enough burn to make her feel it. It made the honey flavor come alive on the tongue as the alcohol evaporated in her mouth. She smiled. Perfect. He relaxed completely and grinned, pouring a little more into the glass before putting the bottle away. I'll still take my tea, though, at my table. Thank you. Oh, and tell Lafayette to go light on the sweets. Some fruit, perhaps? He nodded and turned back to the order screen as she headed to her table. It was not until she walked away, using her shillelagh as a tapstick, that he realized she was blind. Anne sat at her table alone. She ate little, sipping her whiskey and listening to poets she could barely follow, and the few singers trying out new renditions of Christmas carols, getting fancy or simplifying. She felt the urge to get up there herself for once, and ran through her mind for a poem to recite, among her own or one of the others more famous that she could remember. She did recall one she was rather fond of that her grandfather used to recite, by Charles Wolfe, and got up, intending to recite it. She stood by the steps, waiting her turn, struggling to run the words through her mind to freshen them. She was debating asking her new phone to help her remember the poem when other things began to press against her skull. Other words, other thoughts, other memories. She found herself on the stage, not quite in front of the mic, but the hollow insistence of her voice made the device unnecessary. There was no corner of the quiet bar that could not hear her or feel her. Her pain and incumbent madness were plain. A weak mist began to gather at the hem of her skirts and spill out over the blackened wood of the stage. Lost in my own mind, pressed for space by my own memories, trapped by thoughts without end. None of this is mine. All of it. Spilling out, boiling over into my life, taking over, killing all possibility of normal. A song heard on the wind. Voice of lost soul, luring me into danger, trying to make me fall, cost me everything. Can't sleep, drinking oblivion to steal an hour, seeking solace in the nothing. And then I burn, fire eating my soul, making me what I'm not. And the voice in my heart, filling the hole. The applause startled her. A rapid, distant, and high-pitched enough sound to mimic the crackling of fire, and the answering heat began to rise in her body. Suddenly, a cold hand touched her, dropping her temperature sharply in an instant, and she jumped, panicking. Johnny was there, hands on her arms, making her look him in the face. Ceobrannach, he said firmly. John. She almost sighed his name, clutching at straws in the dark. Her vision swam even in the dark fog that was everything but the beautiful elven face before her. She could feel herself losing the battle to remain conscious, could feel the forge fire lapping at the air below her, eager to devour her, waiting for her to fall. She wouldn't wake up from this. She knew it. She clung to the cold limbs holding her above the abyss. Get me out of here, she whispered. No one else would have heard her. Thankfully, he did not sweep her off her feet and carry her out. He slipped Capine's knob discreetly into her hand and set one arm around her back, the other taking her arm and sheltering her against his body as he guided her off the stage and down the steps. It seemed only the space of a breath before they were outside in the cold night air, and she could breathe. He drew her aside from the cafe traffic, away from lingering people, and stepped into a recessed doorway of a closed shop. Breathe, he said softly. Slow and deep. She leaned back against the wall and obeyed, struggling to hold the vision at bay, to keep out of the jaws of sleep. This from the ring? She nodded. There was a rueful laugh in his voice. I was going to ask you how you were faring after, but I see I have my answer. I was all right for a while, she began. Aye, for a bit, he admitted. Had even Mayfold. But you're not, are you? She shook her head, hating to admit it, and paid for the gesture. Her world swam and she lurched forward. He grabbed her again. I've not slept in days. I can't. My body won't let me. I think... The truth began to dawn even as she spoke the words. I think it's trying to protect me from the visions. The nightmare. It comes every time I close my eyes more than a moment. Any time I feel too hot or hear the wrong sounds... I'm afraid I won't wake up this time. I'm terrified, and I'm slipping. She clung to him, growling to herself, I don't want to be the kind of woman needing rescue every time you turn. Well, if you'd asked for help before you reached the point to rescue, he commented dryly. Johnny leaned her back, bracing himself against the wall so that if she fell, she would fall onto him and not out onto the pavement. He pulled a small penny whistle out of his vest pocket and played a short tune, and suddenly she could see the shop door as it flared into view. He opened it inward, looking carefully through it as he put the whistle away. There was only darkness on the other side. He seemed satisfied, turned and gathered her up, carrying her through. She gasped at the sudden drop in temperature. It was colder here than the December weather on the outside, which in her experience was more like September. The cold was welcome. It kept her awake. "How did you can make doors of nothing?" He chuckled. "No, just doors of doorways. 'Tis a wee complicated, but good for emergencies. Trouble is, 'tis not like connecting two known doors. There's no telling where you end up. Luckily, I know this stretch of road." She accepted this, but protested being carried. "I'll walk, thank you. I'll not have you carry me home twice in a row." He set her down, but did not let go. "Very well, but I'm not taking you home." He watched her to make sure she was steady enough before he let go. She looked up at him in the dim light she was only now beginning to register, a little shocked. "Then where?" "Someplace safe, where we can fix this," he said tenderly, brushing calloused fingertips across her forehead. The touch was as light as rose petals. "If you let me." It took the resultant blush threatening to overheat her to the burning point to throw caution to the wind. "Aye," she sighed. "I can't let my pride, or my propriety." His voice was snow-on-silk soft. "Pride can get you killed. Propriety, well, that can just stifle your life." Anne could just make out his eyes and saw the self-depreciating humor in their dark depths. Had anyone else said those words, she might have taken them for warning. He took her arm and began walking her down the cold, dark road before them. Without thinking what she was doing, she thought about her own home, and Capine answered her. She could get her there, but it would not be a straight road, nor would it be exactly safe. Then Johnny was leading her off the path and towards an archway of branches which flared as they neared, opening to yet another location. This one was a snow-covered wood. There was more light, though she could not see a sun through the clouded sky. It was beautiful and delicate, like a sigh. The snow crunched pleasantly underfoot, and what little wind there was made wind chimes of the icicles hanging from the branches. There were a few evergreens that whispered against each other in that wind. This place was what winter meant to her, peaceful, sleeping, that breath the world takes between harvest and rebirth. They followed a little path around a stand of birch and a snow-covered holly thicket, and as the path rounded the bushes it revealed a small, dark house. It was not much different from her own in style, except, on closer inspection, it seemed made of snow. There was a great deal of earth mixed in, making it a mottled brown and white that made it hard to see unless you knew what you were looking for. She glanced back on the path and found it gone. There were no tracks in the snow, nothing to mark their passing or existence. She heard him open the door and allowed him to lead her inside. The outside was less of a shock than the interior. It looked more like a snow cave than a house. There was a chest near a rough wood table with a single chair. There was a recessed shelf carved into the wall with neither pillow nor blanket, but she knew, nonetheless, it was his bed. There were instrument cases of various types stored on shelves of their own, and a beautifully carved Celtic harp set in a place of prominence. There were garlands of some plant she did not know offhand draped through the snow rafters, and an ambient light whose source she could not find. In all, the single room smelled of snow and earth and cold. She should have been freezing, but wasn't quite. Johnny sat her in the only chair, setting it sideways so she could lean against the table if she felt faint. He began to busy himself at the windowless walls, doing something that left behind light trails to her sight. "Is this like my house?" she asked, trying to keep herself awake even as she noticed the similarities. This house, however, felt neither awake under her hand nor dead like the tallows. "Not quite," he answered, still working. "It was a hunting lodge. I found it, took pains to hide it. I fortified it over the years. I use it as a dream fortress. It is a safe place to dream, and it enhances my ability to work with them." "Are all your instruments magical?" she wondered aloud, noticing belatedly that she was able to see them. He gave a half-smile as he worked. "Not at all. They've just been in here too long. It happens even to mundane things in the borderlands." She fell silent, watching him lock the place down. When he was done, he crossed to the chest. It was then that she realized there were 7 latches on it. He chose the 4th, flipping it up and opened the lid. He pulled out a bundle of fur blankets and carried them to the bed, arranging them for ground and top cover. It was then that Anne realized he intended her to sleep here. Words Serafina had spat at her at Halloween drifted back through her mind, but there was nothing in Johnny's manner that spoke of seduction. At this moment, it was fairly clinical. She started to relax, and then realized it was a bad idea. She stood, began pacing to stay awake. Soon he was guiding her over to the bed, sitting her on the edge of it. He tipped her chin up to look at him. "Ceobrannach," he began, "I need you to trust me. Do you? This will be difficult at best, and dangerous an you fight me. For both of us." She nodded, strangely on the verge of tears. She was so tired and so scared. He knelt, taking her foot gently in hand and deftly unlacing her boot. Anne was privately glad she had chosen to wear full, thick hose instead of the shorter, modern socks she had been wearing lately. There was a terrible intimacy in his taking off her boots, but she knew she should read nothing into it. It was not as if she could have done it herself in her current condition. When the second boot joined the first, he lifted her feet and swung her around onto the bed, helping her to lay back and make herself comfortable. She unfastened the buttons on her vest, but nothing more. Let herself sink into the furs. He drew one of them over her, brushing her hair from her face as she looked up at him, still fighting the descent into the darkness. He gave her a wan smile and fetched his harp. He sat on the foot of the bed, his back against one wall and his feet tucked up next to hers, taking up little room. The harp was deeply carved in knotwork, with raven heads in the corners and the suggestion of wings in the honey-gold willow. The harp's voice was sweet and hung in the air, heavy like drops of honey. His voice joined them, light and soft, singing a lullaby that was ancient when Cuchulainn was young. The words were so old even Anne did not recognize some of them, but they had the desired effect. She felt as if large, strong hands were easing her down into the dark waters that so wanted to devour her. She could feel the tears run down her cheeks as she surrendered, letting those hands take her deep into the abyss to fight the forging.